In this video article, we're going to talk about Randy Ingermanson's 3-act, 3-disaster story model. Before we get started, if you want to get an email with a timestamped overview every time I release a new video, head over to deliberate-practice.com, sign up for my email list. Coming soon, I'm going to be creating a course which will have the title of How to Write Your First Short Story and cover all the elements needed if you're a beginner writer. That will be free on YouTube, be a 2.5 hour, 3 hour video, but for email subscribers they'll get the director's cut version, so each individual section will be split and have its own entry with timestamp notes, plus it might have more implementation plans and detail like that that the free YouTube version won't have. So head over to deliberate-practice.com, sign up for that, and as it's being released you'll be first to get access to it. Okay, let's start by asking the question, what is a story model? And basically a story model is simply a way that one person, or more extreme version, one school of thought, views story and how story is set up. E.g., these are story models that you've probably heard of. I've covered some of them already on the channel. Hero's Journey, Dan Harmon's Story Circle, Truby's 22-step model, Dan Wells' 7-step story structure, and so on. And there are plenty more. Remember, each of those aren't definitive guides to story structure. They're how one person or one school of thought has evolved to view how story can be constructed. Randy Ingermanson's model is a refined version of 3-act structure which goes back to Aristotle. Quick caveat before we go a bit deeper: the 3-act, 3-disaster structure is Randy's outer layer of what he calls the plot onion, and it gives a structural spine outline. So it's a big picture outline. It's not a detailed outline that you would then be able to use to start immediately writing the story. And from when you've got your big picture outline, from there he advises identifying the scene and sequel pairs for each section, and then using what are called MRUs to write each scene and sequel pair. MRU stands for Motivation Reaction Unit. You'll find more detail on that in Randy's written a couple of books about it, plus his How to Write Fiction for Dummies book, which he co-wrote with another author whose name escapes me. Additionally, where Randy got this from originally was Dwight Swain's Techniques of the Selling Writer, which is an older book, but it's definitely worth being a book that's in your library that you've read. Okay, so basic 3-act structure. You're probably familiar with this, but we'll just overview it anyway. Act 1, which is the beginning part of the story, first 25% or so of the story. Act 2 is the middle, and it's approximately the middle 50% of the story. Note that some screenwriters break this down into 2 acts, and if you've ever studied anyone like Paul Galino, who does the 8-sequence story method, basically they have 2 sequences for Act 1, 2 sequences for the beginning of Act 2, 2 sequences for the end of Act 2, and 2 sequences for Act 3. And Act 3 is the end, it's the final 25% of the story. So these percentages, by the way, are guidelines, they're not structural constraints. If your beginning is 30%, then it's 30%. If it's 20%, it's 20%. The reason the guidelines exist is you can identify issues with your story at this point. So if your beginning takes up 50% of the story, then you've probably got a problem that needs fixing. Okay, let's look at the acts in slightly more detail. Act 1, establishing the story world. You want to hook the reader with a compelling opening, introduce protagonists in their ordinary world, and note that even when talking about his own personal viewpoint of the story model, Randy uses words and terms and phrases that we'll be familiar with from other story models. So the ordinary world is a Joseph Campbell, Chris Vogler concept, ordinary world and special world, and we'll see some more of these terms as well. Present the inciting incident that disrupts the status quo. Protagonist initially refuses to get involved. That's another Hero's Journey kind of beat, refusal of the call, and end with the first disaster which forces commitment to the journey. That takes us to Act 2, which is developing complications. That will show initial attempts to solve the story problem, but we find out the story problem is bigger or different than expected. There's a midpoint disaster, which forces the protagonist to reassess how they're trying to solve the story problem. Antagonistic forces and stakes then escalate and build towards the third disaster with false victories and setbacks, and the third disaster will set up the final resolution. And that happens in Act 3, the final confrontation, that should say. Protagonist is often here after the third disaster at the lowest point. And this involves rallying of resources for final attempt. All escape routes should be eliminated. That means all possible paths around the resolution should be eliminated, and the third disaster should funnel everything towards a final confrontation, and that climatic confrontation should have the highest possible stakes, and then that should lead to a resolution and a new status quo, even if we don't actually see the hero or the protagonist in the new status quo, but it's just glimpsed in some way. So on top of all that, that's pretty conventional story model stuff. Randy has layered on his 3 disaster structure, and these 3 disasters occur at strategic turning points in the story, and those strategic turning points alter the story trajectory. Those turning points, by the way, are the approximate 25%, 50% and 75% marks of the story. So that's the end of Act 1, the middle of Act 2, the end of Act 2, and that which then sets up Act 3, which will be the climatic confrontation. Each disaster should worsen the situation for the hero, and by having these series of sequential disasters, it creates story momentum and forces the protagonist to make increasingly hard choices, and if you've written your story correctly and the reader has empathy for the character and wants to see them succeed, it makes the reader more and more involved in the story and desiring to find out what happens at the end and how everything resolves. So let's look at the disasters in slightly more detail. So disaster 1 basically is the point of no return, approximately 25% mark of the story. It forces the protagonist to commit to the main storyline. It makes return to normal life impossible without the story problem being resolved. Establishes for us, the audience, what's at stake and the consequences of failure. Let's move to disaster 2, which is the midpoint crisis. That's at the approximate 50% mark of the story. That reveals to us, the audience, and to the hero, although depending on what kind of storyteller you are, you might choose to make that just us, the audience, and not for the character, which creates greater tension because we know something's harder than the character knows. But it basically reveals that the story problem is more complex, more dangerous, more severe than first thought, raises the stakes significantly, deepens the protagonist's commitment to seeing through the story journey and overcoming the story problem, and injects story momentum to the sagging middle to stop the middle. Sometimes the middle of a story can sometimes be a little flat, and writers often describe writing through this middle section difficult to maintain momentum and story interest, and so having a midpoint crisis here injects that story momentum to avoid the sagging middle. Disaster 3, setting up the climax, which occurs at approximately the 75% mark of the story, the end of Act 2. That eliminates all solutions except the most difficult. It creates urgency, and usually that urgency is either a deadline, like a ticking clock of some description, or running out of options and there's only one option left. Forces direct confrontation with the antagonist, and it unifies all narrative threads, so they have to drive towards the resolution. So, closing out. In the next video I'm going to show this model at play with some examples from films, and I often use film examples rather than novel examples because most authors have a much more consistent library of films that they've seen than books that they've read. So I could, if I use books, I could choose, say, 5 books, but there's a good chance that you won't have read many of those not all of those books. Maybe you'll have read 2 or 3 of them, or if you're more like me, you maybe, and you read the kind of things that I read, maybe you've read 4 of them, but some of you won't have read any of them. Whereas if I choose 5 well-known films, the chances are you'll have seen all of those, so the examples will become immediately obvious to you. Also remember, caveat that I've given out in many videos, you as a writer need to find a story model that resonates with you and works with your writing process. And I define writing process as a systematic process that allows you to come up with ideas for stories and allows you to put those stories on the page, revise the stories, and then publish them or put them out in the world in some way, shape or form. That to me is a writing process. Finding your writing process, I think is a writer's hardest job, and some writers who've been writing successfully for 30 years are still refining their process. So it's not something that you suddenly discover and go, hooray, I found my writing process. It's something that you'll always be developing. This is the kind of thing that I talk about in the resource I'm putting together called the Writing Vault. You can see the URL on the screen. There'll be a link in the description. Go and check that out. If you've got any questions on that or on anything covered in this video article, then drop me an email, paul@deliberate-practice.com, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you for spending time watching this video. The next video with the examples will be along shortly, and I'll just close out by leaving a screen with some recommended videos from my channel.